Welcome back to Beyond Essentials, a video-guided curriculum series targeted to help you think beyond the basic fundamental skills and start applying new techniques to succeed in recovery. I'm Taylor, and today's topic is grief and loss. Imagine that a credit card statement arrives in your mailbox. You know you don't have the money to pay for it, and when you see the bill lying there, you get a sinking feeling in the pit of your stomach. Filled with anxiety and fear, you throw it away. After all, out of sight, out of mind, right? The problem is the next month, the bill comes back. This time, more interest has been added, and you still don't have the money to pay for it, causing you even more anxiety. You throw the bill away again, and the cycle repeats. Eventually, though, that bill has to be paid. This is like what many people deal with when they begin the recovery process. Frequently, things happened in people's lives that gave them cause to grieve. The pain of a loss might be so overwhelming that a person starts using substances to dull the pain and to cope. Sometimes the events happen after the substance use disorder has taken root, and so the substance use increases. Either way, substances are used to avoid intense feelings that are part of the grieving process. But like a bill that must get paid, eventually grief needs to be worked through. The most important thing to point out is that there's no right way to grieve a loss. When we lose someone close, either suddenly or over time, grief is not just our reaction, it's our natural coping mechanism kicking in. Some people have spiritual beliefs that allow them to handle losses in stride. Others are resilient. The point of today's discussion is to consider the losses in your life and to begin the process of examination into whether they have been dealt with or merely avoided. Let's pause for a moment so your group can review the handout titled Grief and Loss Myths. Take a moment to review these myths and facts and consider these two discussion questions as a group. Which myths have you heard before, and what's it like to hear that it isn't actually a true fact? Share one or two of the facts on this handout that you found most helpful. Psychiatrist Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross famously described the 5 phases of grief as denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. These phases just describe the kind of emotional responses people typically have when faced with a loss. The denial phase is characterized by shock and a refusal to accept the reality of the loss. Sometimes people will refuse to believe their loss and insist that a mistake has been made. Denial is something the mind does to protect itself from harsh realities, but it can be hard to keep up this defense. The next phase is anger. Some people respond to the loss and what has been taken from them by getting angry at others, themselves, even God. Others feel helpless and vulnerable and then get angry as a defense. The third phase is bargaining. Sometimes people will try to bargain or negotiate to regain some control over a situation that feels uncontrollable. Like when someone with a terrible medical diagnosis promises to reform their life in exchange for more time or tries to bargain with their higher power. Another phase of grief is depression. It is common for people who are grieving to feel extremely sad. It's a natural and healthy part of the grieving process. These feelings can be particularly intense when the person or situation being grieved is one that the person held with mixed emotions. When Dr. Ross mentions depression as a phase of grief, this is not the same thing as the diagnosed mental illness called depression, also called a major depressive episode. That said, In some cases, grief can escalate to the point of clinical concern. For example, feelings of worthlessness and guilt, failure to take adequate care of oneself, or suicidal thoughts. The final phase of the grieving process is acceptance. Acceptance occurs when a person is able to incorporate the loss into the larger narrative of their life. They might even get frustrated with themselves that things have dragged on so long. The important thing to remember is this: people don't get over their grief, but rather they get through it. Acceptance is about acknowledging and honoring the loss while finding meaning in what one has been through. Let's pause here so your group can discuss the handout titled Grieving Well. If you are currently wrestling with a personal loss, use this handout to talk with your individual counselor. A group environment may not be the best place for unprocessed grief. Others, consider identifying one healthy coping skill from this list that you prefer and share with the group. There is one loss everyone in this program will be coping with, and that's the loss associated with giving up substances. Believe it or not, this process follows the typical grief reaction. Most, if not all, people overcoming substance use disorders can look back to a point in their illness where they were clearly in denial. This denial could look like a refusal to accept that substances were the cause and not the response to many of the problems in their lives. The anger that surfaces in the recovery process can also have different faces. Some people are mad at the family member who set a limit with them, the coworker who reported their use, or the police officer who pulled them over. Others become angry with their treatment team. A person's preferred coping mechanism and tool for relaxation or fun is being threatened, so their response to the threat is to lash out. Many people get intense, sad feelings when they envision a life without their drugs of choice. The bargaining that happens in recovery usually takes the form of trying to reduce the drug consumption to social use. One person might swear off hard liquor in favor of wine or beer, or try to set limits around what time of day they use. Other people might bargain by trying to figure out the least amount of treatment they can get away with receiving. Ultimately, the people who thrive in long-term recovery do this by gaining acceptance. This means accepting not only the need to abstain from substances, but also the need to monitor and care for oneself, to make peace with the past, as well as develop an awareness of limitations and strengths. Grieving, or being able to deal with a loss, is an important part of the human experience. Trying to go through life without letting anyone in or without allowing any emotional vulnerability is as unrealistic as it is undesirable. And as understandable as it might be to try to avoid emotional pain, the best way forward is to have a strategy for processing it when it happens. So please, take the discussion from your group today and handouts along with you on your journey in recovery, and work with your individual counselor to design a strategy for how you will deal with grief and loss. Be well.